1940, 11:15 p.m. Taranto Harbor, Italy. The night was calm and ink-black, the kind of Mediterranean stillness that made the stars feel close enough to touch. In the brightly lit officers' club overlooking the harbor, Italian admirals laughed loudly over glasses of wine. Their voices echoed against the marble walls as they mocked the latest British foolishness. "Can you believe it?" one rear admiral chuckled, slapping the table. "The English are sending ancient biplanes against us. Fabric and wood. Stringbags, they call them. Relics from the last war." Laughter erupted. The room was filled with the cream of the Regia Marina, proud, confident, and utterly convinced that their fleet was untouchable. Below them in the harbor lay the pride of Italy, 3 massive battleships, Littorio, Conte di Cavour, and Caio Duilio, safely protected behind torpedo nets, surrounded by destroyers and anti-aircraft guns. The Italians believed no modern navy would dare attack such a fortress. But high above the Adriatic, something was coming. You could barely hear them at first, the low, droning hum of old radial engines cutting through the cold night air. 21 obsolete ferry swordfish biplanes, slow, canvas-covered, and flying at just 90 knots, were approaching from the darkness. British pilots, their faces frozen by the icy wind, sat in open cockpits, knuckles white on the controls. They knew the odds. Everyone had told them this mission was suicide. Yet they kept flying straight toward the most heavily defended harbor in the Mediterranean. Back in the officers' club, the laughter grew louder as another admiral raised his glass. "To the Royal Navy and their flying antiques." No one noticed the faint drone growing steadily closer. No one realized that in less than 30 minutes, their entire world was going to explode. The laughter in the officers' club was suddenly drowned out by the wail of air raid sirens. Searchlights stabbed wildly into the night sky. Anti-aircraft guns opened up with a deafening roar. Tracers tore upward like angry red fireflies. The Italian crews scrambled to their battle stations, still half believing this was some kind of joke. But these were no ordinary attackers. Flying barely 30 feet above the water, the ancient swordfish biplanes came in low and slow. So slow that the Italian gunners kept overshooting them. The Stringbags, as the British called them, were ugly, outdated, and seemed completely out of place in a modern war. Yet that very slowness and their ability to turn tightly made them terrifyingly effective that night. Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Williamson led the first wave of 6 swordfish. His aircraft, nicknamed L4A, rocked violently as flak exploded all around him. You could almost feel the freezing wind whipping through the open cockpit, the vibration of the old Pegasus engine shaking his bones. He lined up on the massive battleship Littorio and released his torpedo. The weapon hit the water with a splash and ran straight toward the target. Then came the explosions. One after another, torpedoes slammed into the anchored Italian fleet. The Conte di Cavour took a devastating hit below the waterline. The Caio Duilio shuddered as another torpedo ripped open her hull. The brand new Littorio, pride of the Italian Navy, was struck twice, massive columns of water shooting skyward as her hull was torn open. Inside the harbor, chaos erupted. Sailors screamed, ships listed heavily. Oil slicks caught fire, turning the calm water into an inferno. The Italians fired frantically at shadows, their modern anti-aircraft guns struggling to track the painfully slow biplanes weaving between the masts and barrage balloons. From his swordfish, Lieutenant Commander Charles Lamb watched the explosions light up the harbor like daylight. He later described the scene as a vision from hell. Back in the officers' club, the laughter had died completely. The admirals now stood in stunned silence at the windows, watching their invincible fleet burn in their own harbor. How was this possible? How were 21 obsolete biplanes doing what no modern air force had been able to do? The explosions kept coming. One by one, the ancient swordfish dropped their torpedoes with deadly accuracy. The night sky above Taranto turned blood red as flames roared across the water. The Conte di Cavour, once the pride of the Italian fleet, was already sinking, her massive hull tilting dangerously as seawater flooded her engine rooms. The Caio Duilio had taken a direct hit amidships and was listing heavily. The brand-new Littorio, the most powerful battleship in the Mediterranean, had been struck twice, her bow shattered, her decks on fire. You can almost smell the burning oil. You can feel the heat on your face, even from a distance. The proud Italian sailors, who had been laughing just minutes earlier, were now jumping into the freezing water or desperately fighting fires on decks that moments ago had seemed untouchable. From the cockpit of his swordfish, Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Williamson pulled up sharply after releasing his torpedo. Flak bursts exploded so close he could feel the shrapnel peppering his canvas wings. His observer shouted over the intercom, "Direct hit on the Littorio, sir! She's burning!" One by one, the swordfish made their attack runs. Some flew so low their wheels almost touched the water. Others weaved between the barrage balloons like ghosts. The Italians were firing everything they had, 20mm cannons, heavy machine guns, even rifles. But the slow, lumbering biplanes were strangely difficult targets. Their very obsolescence became their greatest weapon that night. Back at the command post, Admiral Inigo Campioni, commander of the Italian fleet, stood speechless. His face was pale, lit only by the raging fires in the harbor. Just hours ago, he had dismissed the British threat. Now his 3 biggest battleships were crippled in the safest harbor in Italy. "How?" he whispered. "How are those flying antiques doing this to us?" The second wave of swordfish was already approaching. The Italians had no idea the worst was still to come. The second wave was already inbound. While the harbor burned and Italian gunners frantically tried to find their targets in the smoke and flames, 12 more fairy swordfish emerged from the darkness. They flew even lower than the first wave, skimming just above the waves, their fabric wings glowing orange in a reflected firelight. Lieutenant Commander John Hale led this wave. His observer, Lieutenant George Carline, gripped the rear cockpit as flak exploded all around them. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning fuel. Hale's swordfish rocked violently as a 20mm shell tore through the lower wing, but the old biplane kept flying, stubborn, slow, and unstoppable. "Steady, steady," Hale muttered through clenched teeth. He lined up on the already damaged Littorio and released his torpedo at point-blank range. The weapon struck the battleship with a thunderous boom, sending a column of water and debris high into the night sky. Another swordfish attacked the Conte di Cavour, which was already sinking bow first. A third scored a direct hit on the Caio Duilio, tearing open her starboard side. The Italians were now firing wildly at anything that moved. One swordfish took multiple hits and crashed into the sea in a ball of flames, the only British loss of the night, but the rest pressed home their attacks with ice-cold courage. From the deck of the sinking Conte di Cavour, Italian sailors watched in horror as these obsolete British planes danced through their anti-aircraft fire like they were on a training run. The pride of the Regia Marina, 3 modern battleships that had cost millions and taken years to build, were being crippled by aircraft that looked like they belonged in a museum. Admiral Campioni finally snapped out of his shock. He grabbed a telephone and screamed orders. "Get those damn planes! Sink them all!" But it was too late. As the last swordfish turned for home, disappearing into the black night, the full scale of the disaster became clear. 3 battleships, half of Italy's capital ship strength, were either sunk or out of action for months. The Littorio was badly damaged and would be out for nearly a year. The Conte di Cavour was a total loss. The Caio Duilio was heavily damaged. In just 1 hour, the Royal Navy had changed the balance of naval power in the Mediterranean. And the most shocking part? The British had done it with 21 slow, fabric-covered biplanes that the Italians had openly laughed at just hours earlier. The arrogance was gone. Only stunned silence remained. Dawn broke over Taranto Harbor on November 12, 1940, revealing a scene of utter devastation. Thick black smoke still rose from the listing hulls of the battleships. The once proud Conte de Cavour sat half-submerged, her decks awash. The Caio Duilio leaned heavily to starboard, her crew frantically pumping water. The mighty Littorio, Italy's newest and most powerful battleship, lay crippled at her moorings with a huge torpedo hole in her bow. The harbor was a mess of burning oil slicks, floating debris, and shocked sailors pulling their comrades from the water. You can almost smell the bitter mix of fuel oil and defeat in the air. Admiral Inigo Campioni stood on the waterfront in silence, his uniform coat draped over his shoulders, staring at the wreckage of his fleet. The same man who had laughed the night before now looked 10 years older. No one dared speak to him. The only sound was the gentle lapping of oily water against sinking steel. In Rome, the news hit like a bomb. Mussolini was furious. He demanded explanations. How could the greatest navy in the Mediterranean be humiliated by a handful of obsolete British biplanes? The Italian High Command tried to downplay the attack, calling it a minor nuisance. But the truth could not be hidden. Half of Italy's battleship force, gone in a single night. Meanwhile, far away in the Pacific, Japanese naval officers were paying very close attention. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto studied the reports from Taranto with intense interest. He examined photographs of the sunken ships, the torpedo tracks, and the low-level attack profiles of the Swordfish. A quiet smile crossed his face. "So," he said softly to his staff, "it can be done, even in a heavily defended harbor. If the British can do it with old biplanes, we can do it better." The Italians had laughed at the Swordfish. The Japanese were taking notes. And the world was about to see an even bigger version of this nightmare, exactly 1 year later at Pearl Harbor. The smoke over Taranto had barely cleared when the real shockwaves began to spread. In London, Winston Churchill could barely contain his excitement. He paced his office at 10 Downing Street, cigar in hand, reading the reports with a broad grin. "The Navy has done it again," he declared. "A handful of old aircraft have achieved what the entire fleet could not." The Taranto raid instantly became a legend within the Royal Navy. The obsolete Swordfish, those Stringbags everyone had mocked, had just rewritten the rules of naval warfare in one night. But the story was far from over. Thousands of miles away, in the quiet halls of the Japanese Imperial Naval Staff in Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stared at the detailed reconnaissance photos from Taranto. He studied every angle, the low-level torpedo drops, the way the slow biplanes had evaded the heavy anti-aircraft fire, the devastating effect on anchored battleships. He turned to his officers, his voice calm but intense. "If the British can cripple a fleet in its own harbor with such primitive aircraft, imagine what we could achieve with modern planes and better torpedoes." The Japanese took the lesson to heart. They immediately began modifying their own aerial torpedoes to run in shallow water. They practiced low-level attacks obsessively. They studied the Taranto raid like a blueprint. Exactly 13 months later, on December 7, 1941, the world would witness a much larger, deadlier version of that same night. Pearl Harbor. The Italian admirals who had once laughed at the Swordfish never imagined their humiliation would inspire one of the most infamous surprise attacks in history. Their arrogance didn't just cost them 3 battleships that night, it helped change the entire course of the Pacific War. Back in Taranto, the Italian sailors worked night and day to salvage what they could. The Conte de Cavour would never fight again. The other 2 battleships would be out of action for critical months. The balance of power in the Mediterranean had shifted dramatically in Britain's favor, all because of 21 slow, fabric-covered biplanes that refused to be taken seriously. The Italians mocked the past. The future answered with fire.